April 29th, 1945. A burst of heavy machine gun fire shatters the air. An American lieutenant colonel sprints toward the sound, bursting into a coal yard. He finds his own men firing point-blank into a line of unarmed, surrendered German soldiers. He draws his pistol, fires a warning shot into the air, and physically forces the machine gunner away. The soldier turns to him, weeping. "Colonel, they had it coming." In a matter of seconds, a respected commander had to draw his weapon on his own grieving men, stepping between a victim and an executioner who wore his exact same uniform. This is not simply another recounting of the liberation of Dachau, nor is it a debate over whether the SS guards deserved their fate. It is the story of an agonizing moral collapse and a commander forced to navigate an impossible space between military law, profound grief, and absolute vengeance. The men pulling the triggers in that coal yard were not undisciplined recruits or rogue killers. They were some of the most battle-hardened, cohesive combat veterans in the United States Army. Yet, within a matter of hours, their unyielding discipline completely disintegrated. The core dilemma of Felix Sparks raises a profound question. How does an officer enforce the rigid conventions of warfare when the enemy standing before them has seemingly abandoned every trace of human decency? Sparks found himself trapped in a terrible paradox. He recognized instantly that the execution of disarmed prisoners was an undeniable military crime, which was why he intervened by force to halt the firing. But later, he steadfastly refused to let his soldiers be categorized as cold-blooded war criminals. He became the fierce protector of the very men he had just held at gunpoint.
To comprehend how highly trained veterans snapped so violently in a German courtyard, and why their commander would ultimately stand between them and a military tribunal, the story cannot start at the gates of the camp. We must first look at the crucible that forged them, and understand exactly who these men were before they crossed the threshold into hell. The man at the center of this impending collapse was just 27 years old, but in the brutal, accelerated arithmetic of frontline infantry combat, he was an elder statesman.
Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment, a core element of the legendary 45th Infantry Division known as the Thunderbirds. By the time his boots hit the Bavarian plains in the final weeks of April 1945, Sparks and his men had been at war for nearly 2 years of uninterrupted hell. They had waded ashore in the contested invasion of Sicily, fought through the bloody, grinding stalemate of Salerno, endured the freezing misery and constant artillery bombardment of the Anzio beachhead, and pushed relentlessly through southern France. They had survived the unforgiving winter combat of the Vosges Mountains, an agonizing campaign where entire rifle companies were chewed to pieces in the freezing mud and had to be reconstituted with terrified replacements. Through all of this mechanized slaughter, Felix Sparks had built a reputation that bordered on absolute reverence among his subordinates.
In a military apparatus that often relied on the loud, performative authority of its officers or the rigid threat of discipline, Sparks was a quiet, unshakable anomaly. He did not rule his battalion by intimidation, cruelty, or fear. He commanded through a quiet, almost unsettling self-control. He led from the front, refusing to issue orders from the safety of a rear echelon bunker. When enemy 88mm shells shattered a tree line, or when a sudden German armored counterattack threatened to overrun their forward positions, Sparks remained the anchor. His men knew, with absolute certainty, that their commander would never spend their lives carelessly. He possessed a rare, vital capacity to process the deafening chaos of a battlefield and make calculated, rational decisions while others gave in to panic. This profound emotional restraint was the defining characteristic of his leadership. It was the precise glue that held the 3rd Battalion together when casualty rates climbed beyond the point of human endurance. Sparks taught them how to survive by teaching them how to maintain their composure under impossible pressure. By the spring of 1945, the men of the 3rd Battalion were functioning entirely on raw nerve, adrenaline, and muscle memory. The physical toll of the European theater was etched into their hollowed-out faces, visible in their deliberate, energy-conserving movements and apparent in the mechanical precision with which they executed their daily duties. They were no longer the eager, wide-eyed recruits who had shipped out of the United States. They were hardened survivalists, carrying the immense psychological weight of constant combat. They had seen their closest friends torn apart by shrapnel, frozen solid in winter trenches, and shot down in vicious urban street fighting. They thoroughly understood the grim, brutal rules of conventional warfare. You maneuver, you fight, you kill. You take prisoners when the enemy throws down their arms, and you keep moving forward toward the next objective.
They had developed a thick psychological armor, a necessary and profound compartmentalization that allowed them to step over the mutilated bodies of the fallen, both friend and foe, and continue the mission without losing their minds. They deeply believed they had already seen the absolute worst that human beings could inflict upon one another. As April drew to a close, the Third Reich was actively disintegrating around them. The once vaunted German war machine was collapsing into disorganized, chaotic pockets of resistance. For the exhausted men of the 45th Division, the primary objective was no longer achieving glorious victory. It was simply surviving the final inevitable days of the conflict. Nobody wanted to be the last man killed in a war that the Allies had already clearly won. On the morning of April 29th, the orders that came down from division headquarters seemed perfectly routine, just another tactical coordinate on the map. The 3rd Battalion was tasked with securing the left flank of the division's rapid advance toward Munich, the ideological birthplace of the Nazi regime. Their specific objective was to capture a sprawling, heavily walled installation near a small, quiet Bavarian town called Dachau. The intelligence provided to Sparks and his company commanders was remarkably vague. They were told it was an abandoned or lightly held SS facility, possibly a training area or a logistics garrison, and that it contained a concentration camp. But to a frontline infantryman in the spring of 1945, the term concentration camp did not yet carry the apocalyptic industrialized weight it would soon permanently acquire in the history books. The phrase suggested a heavily guarded military prison, a political detention center, or perhaps a brutal forced labor camp for dissidents. It was simply a tactical objective, a piece of geography that needed to be systematically cleared of enemy combatants so the regiment could safely continue its push southeast. Sparks assigned the point of the mission to I Company, commanded by Captain William Walsh, with L Company moving closely in support. The men meticulously checked their weapons, loaded into their transport vehicles, and began the approach. The weather was a bitter, damp gray, characteristic of early spring in southern Germany, perfectly matching the grim, businesslike mood of the soldiers. They expected resistance, but of a standard, manageable variety. They anticipated perhaps a few fanatical SS stragglers determined to fight a hopeless rear-guard action, or a demoralized garrison eager to throw down their weapons and surrender to the Americans rather than face the wrath of the advancing Soviet army in the east. As they advanced through the quiet outskirts of the town, their minds were firmly locked into the established parameters of conventional combat. They were calculating fields of fire, watching second-story windows for snipers, and scanning intersections for concealed anti-tank guns. They were mentally prepared for a firefight. They were prepared to take casualties. They were prepared to accept the surrender of a defeated enemy, according to the strict guidelines of the Geneva Conventions. What they were absolutely not prepared for was a reality that defied all military logic and human comprehension.
The conflict that was about to completely break these seasoned veterans was not a sudden ambush or a massive, overwhelming artillery barrage. It was the devastating, high-speed collision between their expectation of a standard mop-up operation and the sheer, unimaginable scale of the atrocity waiting quietly behind the concrete walls of the camp. The tactical approach to the facility led them toward a sprawling rail yard on the western edge of the complex. There was no immediate gunfire to greet them. Instead, there was a strange, deeply unsettling silence, broken only by the crunch of their combat boots on the gravel. And then, there was the smell.
It was a sweet, sickening, overpowering odor that even these seasoned combat veterans could not quite identify. A foul scent that clung to the damp morning air and seemed to coat the back of their throats. As the lead elements of I Company moved cautiously along the iron tracks, they spotted a long line of rail cars. It looked like a standard, open-topped transport train, seemingly abandoned on the siding. The men approached with their rifles raised and fingers on the triggers, expecting to find hidden enemy supplies, stockpiled ammunition, or perhaps retreating troops trying to wait out the advance. Instead, they found the threshold of a new, incomprehensible world. The impenetrable psychological armor these men had forged through 2 years of relentless, bloody combat was about to fail them. The iron discipline that Felix Sparks had so painstakingly instilled in them would evaporate entirely within 10 minutes of arriving at those boxcars.
As the men of I Company edged closer to the abandoned train, the sickening odor grew so intense that some soldiers began to violently retch into the gravel. When the first infantrymen hoisted themselves up onto the rusted sides of the open boxcars, they froze. Inside the cars were thousands of emaciated corpses. They were stacked like cordwood, tangled together in a desperate, frozen mass of human suffering. The men were staring into what would later be known as the Death Train, a transport that had traveled for weeks from Buchenwald, packed with starving prisoners, left to slowly die of exposure and hunger on a remote siding. The seasoned combat veterans of the 3rd Battalion, men who had seen their friends ripped apart by artillery in Italy and France, had never seen anything like this. A dead soldier on a battlefield is a tragic consequence of war. Thousands of starved, frozen civilians packed into rail cars was something entirely different. It was an industrialized process.
The sight triggered an immediate, profound psychological snap among the troops. The thick mental armor they had built to survive the war instantly shattered. Some soldiers broke down in tears right there by the tracks. Others vomited uncontrollably. But the overwhelming, dominant emotion that rapidly consumed the unit was a cold, blinding rage. Leaving the rail yard behind, the men pushed into the main compound of the camp, their discipline rapidly unspooling. They discovered the crematorium, with its massive brick ovens still warm to the touch.
They found the medical blocks, and then they saw the barracks. Staring back at the advancing Americans were the hollow, skeletal faces of thousands of prisoners clinging to the last threads of life. The realization struck the soldiers with devastating force. They had not captured a military target. They had walked into a massive, highly organized factory designed specifically for the systematic extermination of human beings. For 2 years, these American infantrymen had fought under the strict understanding that the enemy was a soldier, bound by the same laws of war as they were. But walking past the ovens and the stacked bodies, that fundamental contract disintegrated. The German soldiers tasked with guarding this facility were no longer viewed as legitimate combatants who could simply raise their hands and expect to be treated with the dignity of prisoners of war. The psychological shift was absolute and terrifying. The SS guards, in the eyes of the men of the 3rd Battalion, ceased to be human beings protected by the Geneva Conventions. They became the living manifestation of the absolute evil surrounding them. The rules of war had been rendered entirely meaningless, setting a volatile, deadly stage for the confrontation waiting in the coal yard. The total collapse of order inside Dachau did not happen in a single coordinated moment, but rather as a rapid series of violent fractures as the American soldiers spread out through the sprawling complex. The most significant fracture occurred near the camp's heating plant, in a large, walled coal yard. A group of American infantrymen from I Company, their faces tight and eyes burning with the fresh horror of the death train and the crematorium, had rapidly rounded up several dozen SS guards. These were the men who had been running the facility, now separated from their posts and herded against a high brick wall.
From the perspective of the German guards, the procedure unfolding in the coal yard was entirely standard military protocol for a defeated force. They were seasoned members of the SS, aware that the war was lost and their position was indefensible. They had yielded to a vastly superior force. They had unslung their rifles, dropped their sidearms, and raised their hands, fully expecting the Americans to process them as prisoners of war. They stood against the wall in a loose line, assuming they would be searched, documented, and eventually marched to the rear under armed escort, exactly as dictated by international law. They fatally underestimated the depth of the psychological shock that had just shattered the men standing opposite them. They expected a professional military handover. They failed to realize that in the minds of their captors, the status of soldier no longer applied to anyone wearing an SS uniform in Dachau. The atmosphere in the yard was heavy, thick with tension and the lingering sweet smell of the camp. There was no shouting, no chaotic brawling, no immediate physical violence. Instead, there was a terrifying, dead silence. The American infantrymen did not immediately move to search the prisoners or secure the perimeter. They simply stood there, weapons raised, staring at the men against the wall. The silence stretched on, becoming unbearable. It was in that heavy silence that a sudden, palpable panic began to set in among the German ranks. The guards exchanged nervous glances. They noticed the white-knuckle grips the Americans had on their rifles, the tears streaming down the faces of hardened combat veterans, and the cold, unblinking stares of men who had just looked into the ovens. The standard protocol was not happening. The realization slowly dawned on the guards that they were not being treated as prisoners of war. They were being viewed as monsters trapped in a cage. The tension finally snapped, triggered by an action that remains heavily disputed in the historical record. Some accounts suggest a guard made a sudden movement, perhaps reaching for a concealed weapon or attempting to flee in a moment of pure panic. Others claim an American officer simply could no longer contain his rage and signaled for the execution to begin.
What is documented is that a command, either spoken or gestured, was given, and an American machine gunner, stationed behind a heavy .30 caliber weapon, opened fire. The heavy rounds tore into the line of surrendered men, dropping them against the brick wall. It was the sound of this heavy machine gun fire that reached Felix Sparks. When he sprinted into the coal yard and physically forced the weeping gunner away from his weapon, he found himself standing in the epicenter of a command nightmare. The bodies were already on the ground. A war crime, explicitly forbidden by the Army regulations he was sworn to uphold, had just been committed by his own men. His immediate, forceful intervention, firing his pistol into the air and asserting his authority, temporarily halted the slaughter in the coal from the absolute brink of mass execution. But Sparks quickly realized that the breakdown of discipline was not confined to that single yard. It was a contagion spreading rapidly across the entire camp. Simultaneously, localized vengeance was erupting in different sectors. Near Tower B, one of the main guard posts, another group of Americans had captured the sentries. Rather than taking them prisoner, the Americans shot them, sending their bodies falling from the catwalks. Deep inside the prisoner enclosures, the newly liberated inmates, starved and brutalized for years, turned on their former tormentors.
They found hiding SS guards and the despised capos, inmates who had collaborated with the Nazis to maintain order, and beat them to death with whatever crude weapons they could find: shovels, wooden planks, and bare hands. Most distressingly for military order, in many of these instances, American soldiers simply stood by and watched the mob violence unfold, making a conscious decision to not intervene. They allowed the prisoners to enact the brutal justice they felt was denied by the slow machinery of military law. Faced with a rapidly disintegrating situation and a battalion of veterans who had completely lost their moral compass, Sparks made an isolating and highly controversial tactical decision. He realized that the only way to stop the spiral of violence was to physically remove the remaining targets from the environment. He ordered his men to gather every surviving SS guard they could find in the camp. He then placed these guards into a secure enclosure, placing a heavy guard detail around them with explicit orders to shoot anyone who tried to harm them. Sparks, the liberator of Dachau, was now effectively guarding the architects of the Holocaust to protect them from the righteous, blinding fury of his own men and the liberated prisoners. He had re-established command, but he knew the situation was fundamentally broken. The shooting in the coal yard had stopped, but the bodies were already on the ground. The Army had strict, inflexible procedures for investigating the murder of unarmed prisoners, and Sparks knew that sooner or later the investigators would arrive, demanding answers for the blood spilled by his broken battalion. The investigators did arrive, and they brought with them the cold, clinical reality of military law, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that had consumed the 3rd Battalion. A formal inquiry was rapidly initiated, led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker, the Assistant Inspector General of the 7th Army. The investigation team descended on Dachau not to view the horrors of the camp, but to meticulously document a crime scene. The focus shifted entirely from the physical combat of securing the facility to the rigid, bureaucratic scrutiny of the coal yard. Whitaker and his team operated with methodical precision. They photographed the bodies against the brick wall. They mapped the bullet trajectories, noting the angle and spread of the heavy machine gun fire. They carefully recorded the spent shell casings scattered across the gravel. The investigators then began the arduous process of interviewing witnesses, pulling aside the exhausted men of I Company and demanding sworn statements about exactly who gave the order to fire and who pulled the trigger. The physical evidence they collected was undeniable, and the conclusion they reached was legally inescapable. The killing of disarmed, surrendered prisoners in the coal yard was a blatant, indisputable violation of the rules of engagement and the Geneva Conventions. It was a war crime. Felix Sparks found himself crushed into an impossible, agonizing dual position. He did not attempt to deny the event. He had, after all, fired his own weapon to stop the slaughter. And crucially, he did not portray Whitaker or his investigators as heartless bureaucrats or villains acting out of malice. They were simply executing their duty, enforcing the very military regulations that separated a disciplined army from an armed mob. But the conflict Sparks faced was the profound collision between objective military law and the subjective, unimaginable trauma his soldiers had just endured. Sparks agreed, fundamentally and legally, that murder was wrong, but he also knew, with absolute certainty, that the investigators measuring bullet holes in the coal yard had not smelled the boxcars on the death train. They had not looked into the crematorium ovens while they were still warm.
The investigators were applying the sterile logic of a courtroom to men whose minds had just been shattered by the absolute worst of human depravity. The paperwork was eventually finalized, the formal charges were drafted, and the findings were sent up the chain of command. Sparks could do nothing more. He was forced to wait, helplessly, for the highest levels of the United States military to decide if the men he had led through 2 years of hell would now face a firing squad of their own. The meticulously compiled files of the Whitaker investigation moved steadily up the rigid chain of command. They passed from division headquarters, through the 7th Army apparatus, and eventually landed on the desk of General George S. Patton, whose 3rd Army had recently assumed administrative control over the region. For decades, a popular, cinematic myth has surrounded this exact moment in the aftermath of Dachau.
The enduring legend claims that Patton, upon reading the murder charges against the men of the 45th Division, flew into a theatrical, expletive-laden rage. The story insists he tore the investigation papers to shreds, threw them into a roaring fireplace, and loudly declared that he would never court-martial American soldiers for killing SS guards. But military justice does not operate by throwing official Inspector General reports into the fire. The historical reality of what happened to the investigation was far quieter, highly bureaucratic, and ultimately far more profound. There was no theatrical performance in the commanding general's office. Instead, there was a solemn, agonizing review of the facts. The senior command staff examined the sworn testimonies, the grim photographs of the coal yard, and the chilling, undeniable context of the death train that had triggered the collapse. They were forced to weigh the inviolable laws of war against the absolute, mind-shattering horror their infantrymen had uncovered on that siding. Ultimately, a quiet, pragmatic decision was made at the highest echelons. The recommendations for courts-martial were formally dismissed. The charges against the men of I Company were quietly suppressed, effectively buried deep within the vast administrative paperwork of a victorious army hastily transitioning to post-war occupation. It was a silent, unwritten acknowledgement from the United States military brass that the circumstances at Dachau were so exceptionally grotesque that conventional military justice simply could not be cleanly applied. The men of the 3rd Battalion would not face a firing squad, nor would they spend decades in a federal penitentiary. They were quietly reassigned, eventually sent home to try and forget the nightmare they had survived. But for Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, the bureaucratic dismissal of the charges did not erase the profound moral weight of that afternoon. He had achieved his ultimate goal. He had successfully shielded his exhausted, traumatized combat veterans from the severe legal consequences of their temporary madness. Yet, he was left carrying a permanent, agonizing psychological paradox. He had risked his own life, drawing his weapon on his own grieving soldiers, because he absolutely refused to let them become cold-blooded murderers.
He demanded that they retain their humanity in a place designed to extinguish it. But by accepting the quiet dismissal of the official charges, he was also forced to accept that a documented war crime had gone completely unpunished. He had navigated a terrifying moral gray area where the written law failed to provide a just answer. When the war in Europe finally ended, Sparks packed his uniforms, left the ruins of Germany behind, and returned to the quiet normalcy of civilian life in the United States. But he could never truly leave behind the impossible contradiction he had witnessed in the coal yard. Felix Sparks returned to the United States profoundly altered by the vast chasm he had witnessed between rigid legal procedure and raw, emotional justice. He did not turn his back on the rules that had failed to provide a clear answer in Germany. Instead, he immersed himself entirely within them.
He went to law school, passed the bar, and built a long career in the legal system, eventually taking the bench to serve as a judge in Colorado for decades. This post-war career was not a neat, quiet epilogue to his military service. It was the direct, inevitable culmination of his entire character arc. Sparks spent the rest of his life interpreting, applying, and strictly enforcing the written law precisely because he had stood in a coal yard and seen the terrifying, chaotic void that opens the exact moment the law is abandoned. He understood that when grieving, angry men decide they are the ultimate arbiters of life and death, even for a deeply justifiable reason, civilization instantly fractures. He knew how quickly a disciplined infantryman could devolve into an executioner. Yet, sitting high on a polished wooden bench, Judge Felix Sparks lived with a constant, inescapable internal struggle. He presided over civilian courtrooms, ruling on evidence and statutes, while carrying a dark, isolating truth that few of his peers could ever comprehend. True justice and the written law are sometimes completely incompatible. The legal codes in his bound books were designed for a rational, functioning society, but he knew firsthand that those codes broke down entirely when confronted with the absolute, industrialized evil of the death train. He never offered a simplistic, comforting moral judgment of the liberation of Dachau. He refused to paint the American infantrymen as flawless, righteous heroes, nor would he allow them to be branded as equivalent villains for their momentary collapse. To the end of his life, his perspective remained rooted in the impossible contradiction of that afternoon. It all ultimately came down to how Sparks processed the memory of his weeping machine gunner standing over a smoking weapon. When asked about those chaotic minutes, Felix Sparks offered neither a blanket pardon nor a hollow condemnation. He knew the line separating a disciplined soldier from an executioner was agonizingly thin, and on that April morning it had completely washed away in the ash of the camp. He had drawn his own pistol, to force his exhausted veterans back from a psychological abyss, demanding they hold on to the humanity their enemy had so willingly discarded. To his dying day, the judge never once regretted intervening to stop the slaughter. But looking back at the open boxcars and the staggering machinery of death, he never claimed he did not understand exactly why they pulled the trigger.